Hello and welcome back to the next video in our series on APIs. Now in the previous video we've talked about what APIs are and how they work, but one thing that we didn't cover is how you can actually find APIs to use. Now as you know, we're looking for a translation API that we can then go and use on Retool to build a translation app. But before that, let me tell you how you actually find, well, really an API for anything. Now, I'm off the screen this time because we're going to be on this website here, RapidAPI, and I want to make sure you can see all of it. So if you go to rapidapi.com, you're going to find this website, and you can think of it essentially as a marketplace for APIs. So when you want to solve a problem with an API, you usually have, one of two choices. Either you know a specific provider like Facebook or Amazon or Netflix, where you know you want to consume their API and you can just go and find it, or you have a problem that you want to solve. And there's some really good examples right here along the top. Say for example, you want to send a text message. It might not be immediately obvious to you which API you could use to do that. And so you can come on a marketplace like RapidAPI and find lots of different example APIs that could solve this problem for you, either for free, such as these options here, or you might want to use a sort of paid premium provider such as Twilio SMS. So there's all sorts of different problems that you might want to solve that might not require a specific vendor. And if you take a little look through this website, there's lots of options here. So, for example, if you wanted to get recipe information, this API here has got you covered. If you wanted to get weather data, then the Open Weather Map API has you covered. COVID data, there's lots of different things. And every little box you see here is a different API that's recommended by RapidAPI. And of course, up the top, as I showed you with the free SMS, we then have all these kind of curated, best of breed APIs, and there's some really, really cool stuff that you can do in here. But it also starts to give you an idea of what APIs can actually do. You can see things like text-to-speech, geocoding, memes, lots of different stuff that you can try out. However, we've talked obviously about finding a translation API. Now you could pop into if I just go all the way back here, you could pop into top translation APIs, and you'll see some of the things you would expect in here, like Google Translate, which everyone knows, Microsoft Translate, which is kind of the same thing. And there's even some kind of fun translation APIs here as well. For example, if you want to translate text into Yoda and how he speaks in the Star Wars franchise, then you could use that API there. Now, I've already went ahead and done my research, and I found an API in particular that I want to use. If you go up to the search here and type in Lecto, L-E-C-T-O, translation. Now, what this is actually going to do is take me to this API specific page. You're going to see this load in a second, but every single API has this same kind of profile here on RapidAPI. And it's a little bit intimidating at first, but what we've got is, on the left, we have a list of all the different requests that are available. RapidAPI calls them an endpoint, and that is kind of the proper technical name. Every different request you would call an endpoint. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 endpoints here on the left, and you'll recognize these have got the words that we learned in the previous video: get, post, etc. In the middle, you then have the various different parameters. You can see that word there that go into the API call, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in a second. And then on the right-hand side here, you have code examples. So the vast majority of people who use APIs are programmers, they are coders, and therefore they want to see code examples. Now, on the right here, this might not mean a lot to you at first glance. This is essentially a bit of code that if you went and pasted it into a programming tool, it would let you make the API call. So RapidAPI just tries to make a programmer's job easier. Now, as I say, it's a little bit intimidating, but actually if you look at it, you'll kind of see it mirrors some of the things we've learned. So, we've talked about post and get. Well, it's simply called a method here, and you can see it says method post. We've talked about this idea that every API has a URL where that API lives, for want of a better phrase, and here you go, here's a URL here. And then if we have a look in the middle where it says header parameters, now don't worry too much about what this says, but you can see we've got one called accept encoding, RapidAPI host, RapidAPI key, and again you can see this replicated over here. So thankfully this is not a programming video. We don't really need to read too much into the programming, but that does give you an idea of what you'll find there. And then you've also got example responses. Now again, this is a little bit more complex. We are going to dive into that in just a second, but essentially what you have here are the requests on the left, all the parameters in the middle, and then responses on the right. Now, this little button here on my screen says test endpoint, but in yours it'll probably say subscribe or subscription or something like that. And then click into pricing. And you'll see here that there are various pricing options. Now I've went ahead and selected basic, but for APIs that do translation, almost all of them charge money. Most APIs, and especially translation APIs, will come with a certain number of requests that you can make for free before you're going to be charged. So I do need to ask you to pop your card details in here. Now you do have a limit of 300 requests. There's no way we're going to hit that in this video. If you do some testing yourself and you keep making API requests, then in theory you could hit over 300 in 1 month, and then it will start to charge you afterwards. But you know, for now, if you pop a card in there, we'll go through the tutorial. It definitely will not charge you as long as you follow the exact steps I'm taking. You know, if you do finish the tutorial and you're quite happy, then you can come in, you can unsubscribe and you won't be charged anything. Or if you really are building a translation app and you want to, you know, go and make a serious effort of this, then it's probably worth understanding the pricing plans and just how that works. But at the minute, I've put my card details in here already. Obviously I don't want to show that on screen, but I've done that here already. If you go ahead and do the same, then we can continue on with the video. But just as a reminder, this does give you a total limit of 300 requests a month before you're charged, so you should not be paying anything. You know, Lecto simply needs that card in case you do go over your allowance. But you know, feel free to pause the video and go and do that. And then once you're back, let's click here, back into endpoints. So it's just going to load up this little API playground, and indeed we're going to start having a little play with this. So on the left hand side, as I mentioned, you can see your various different requests. So let's just have a quick look at how this works. So I'm going to select the list languages get request, and you'll see you've got this test endpoint button up on your screen as well. Now if I scroll down here quickly, all the information is filled in. I do not have any additional parameters that I need, you know, that I'm required to enter. So let's just go ahead and hit test endpoint and see what happens. Now when I click that, that's making an API call. If you've just clicked that right now, then you have just made your very first API call. That will start to count towards your request, but you can quickly see, you know, that's 1 out of 300. You've got plenty here to work with. So if we look on the right, we kind of have this fairly confusing, almost intimidating looking you know, text, let's say, and there's a name for this. It's a certain way of writing information that comes back from an API. It's called JSON. You can see it written over here on the left where it says translate JSON payload, JSON. It stands for JavaScript Object Notation, but that of course is a very confusing technical term. What it really means is a kind of shorthand way of storing information. So let me just quickly explain it. Now, before I do this, I just want to bear in mind this is quite a technical concept. It is one of the closest you'll come to writing any sort of code or reading any sort of code. We've done a much bigger, longer video on this that explains it in a lot more depth, where you learn how to read JSON and also, in fact, how to write JSON. That's part of our API Fundamentals series. You'll find the link down below. And, you know, if you are kind of struggling with this, don't worry too much, because we're going to use it practically in the next video and it will start to make more sense. But if you do want to go and study up on that and learn a little bit more, I highly recommend that. And you'll find the video on that in the API Fundamentals. So take a look at that. But let me try and keep this as simple as possible. Whenever you see this little open curly bracket, what that's essentially telling you is that everything that follows that bracket, everything that's written down afterwards, is some sort of piece of information, some sort of piece of data. And if you were to scroll all the way to the bottom, which I'll do here, you can see there's a sort of closing bracket. So what this is essentially saying is everything in between that first bracket and this last bracket, it's all data. Now let's look next at this little square bracket. Now, if you remember from the last slide in the last video, we talked about arrays, and we said that every array, is essentially data that's included within an open square bracket, and if I scroll all the way down, a closing square bracket. And of course, an array is a list. So what this is essentially telling us is, over here, okay, we have a big bit of data, and what this is telling us is that data is mostly a big list, and everything after that square bracket or inside that square bracket is essentially all of the data within the list. And because it says languages here with this little quotation mark plus a little colon to separate it, what we're saying is we have an array or a list called languages. And of course, an array is a numbered list, so every item within that array has a number beginning at 0. And if I click in here, well, we now have another bracket. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated because you're sort of layering on brackets and squares, but if you sort of start to draw it out, it makes sense, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. But essentially what we're saying is the first item in an array, which starts at 0, is its own little bit of data, and it's got 4 items inside it. And we have a language code, a display name. We have these two things here, support source and support target. Don't worry about them. It's just part of the API. You don't really have to know everything. And if you were to go and look up the API's documentation in more detail, I'm sure it would be explained. But it doesn't really matter. What does matter is a language code and a display name. So every language, there's this kind of standard. It's written up here. It's called ISO 6391. Every language in the world, such as English, Spanish, etc., they all have a 2-letter code or a 3-letter code sometimes that explains what they are. So Afrikaans, which I believe is a language that originated in South Africa, that's AF. English is EN, Spanish, which of course is Espanol, that is ES, so on and so forth. And as you start to click down these and just have a wee look, you'll see more languages you probably recognise. Albanian has got the code SQ. If I keep going, Arabic has got the code AR, so on and so forth. But what we're essentially saying here is we have an array of items, and each item is a language, which is what it's saying here. And if we go into those languages, then every language has a language code and a display name. And if you look down, you'll see on the left what we call the key, which is kind of like the name of this piece of data. You can see it's always the same. It's always language code, display name, support, source, so on and so forth. Every single item, if I go to item 7, it's all the same. But the bit that changes is on the other side of this colon. So it's AF, it's Afrikaans, it's Albanian, Arabic, etc. So that can be a little tricky to understand, but you can probably start to see the pattern. It's starting to make some sort of sense. Now, don't worry about it too much, because in the next video, we're going to show you how to kind of cut through that and really understand it. And we'll also write a little bit of our own in just a second. But if I click back into example responses, you'll see you've broadly got the same thing. Really, if you were a programmer, this is kind of how you would you would actually interpret an API. But whenever you go through a RapidAPI, you'll see all sorts of little kind of bits of documentation that explain how the API work. So obviously I've mentioned, for example, in that previous little tab here, don't worry about support source, don't worry about support target. This kind of tells you a little bit about what they do. So that's your first API call, and it was asking us, it was essentially a request that said, let's get a list of languages, and indeed we've went ahead and got a list of languages. So let's play with some of the other requests we've got here. Now, I'm going to ignore these two in the middle. Detect language will obviously detect a language if you put some sort of text in it, as it says here, in slightly convoluted language. But I'm going to go for translate text. Now, the interesting thing about this API, the thing I like about this API, is it lets you batch translate things. So rather than just translate one thing at a time, you can actually put a full conversation in here and translate the entire thing at once. Now that does make it a little bit more complex, and you might be wondering why we're not starting off with something simpler. Well, the answer is, by starting off with something a little bit more complex, we can start to explain, frankly, just some of the things that you really need to know about APIs like JSON and like arrays. So yes, it's a little bit more difficult than perhaps some of the other API fundamental videos we've done, but you're going to learn a little bit more here. So Here we have a post for translating text. Now, when we asked to list languages, we didn't really have to let the API know everything. We just want to know every language that's ever existed. It's a pretty simple question, even if it's probably a fairly difficult answer. But when we want to translate text, we have more information to give, right? Because we have to say what kind of text we want to translate, what language do we want to translate it to, which language do we want to translate it from. So down here we have what you'll probably hopefully recognise as another little bit of JSON, and compared to the response that we saw earlier, this is actually a little bit simpler. So let's quickly have a look at this instruction and then we'll talk through it. So we call it a JSON object. An object is just another name for a bit of data. You can think of that as if you are opening a Microsoft Excel file, then the spreadsheet that you're opening, that's kind of the object, and then all of the different cells are all the information within the object. So that's one way to think about it. But we can see we've got three things. So we've got this called text, which is an array of original text, so it's a list of text. We've got to, which is of course an array of, or a list of languages that you want to translate into. So for example, you could all at once translate all of the text from English, and you could translate that into German, Spanish and French all at the same time. And then we have this optional, from, so you can either let the API detect what language the text is in, or you can kind of you can tell it what to translate from. So let's then see how that maps onto our JSON object. So again, we've got the curly brackets, which kind of tells you or denotes that this is now a piece of data. And all they've really done here in the example is hit enter. All this kind of spacing doesn't really matter. They just space it out so it's easier to read. But we've then got an arrays. Now we know we've got an array because we get the squared brackets. And we know this one is a text array because we've got the writing here, we've got the colon, and then we've got the square bracket. So we've got two bits of text in here. Now, whenever you put text in a JSON a piece of data, you always use air quotation marks. So it's always going to be like this. So they wrote, just try it, mate. I'm going to change that up a little bit. Let's say hello. And whenever you see this comma, this is basically saying, okay, we've finished that item in the list, now move on to the next item. So we're going to change this and we're going to say, how are you? So really simple, and you can do the same thing on your end. You can change that text to be whatever you want. I'm just going to show you this. So you say, hello, how are you, etc. Now, in the to, again, you could put multiple languages here. Let's just stick with one. Now, I'm not quite sure what language code HI is for. I'm going to change it to something I know, which is ES, which is Spanish, Espanol, Spanish. And I'll leave the from as English because, of course, this is English. So, take a little look at this. But essentially what I've got is we want to translate two bits of text, hello and how are you. We want to translate them to Spanish and we want to translate them from English. Now, this is about as technical as it gets. So, if you're struggling with that a little bit, that's perfectly normal. One thing that I will point out, as you write things in here, it does also translate over there. And again, you might recognise from the previous video, when we do a list, for example, an array of text, they always show up in the square brackets, and you can see it there as well. The way this is spaced out can be somewhat intimidating, but if you simply look over here, this is kind of what it looks like in a sentence. This is your data, and it's all just separated like that. So that might help you, it might not. But let's go ahead and hit test endpoint, and hopefully it starts to bring this to life. So we've wrote hello and how are you. Let's see how that translates. So again, we get this sort of formatted response. So we've got our object. Within that, we have an array called translation. So this is all the different things that's been translated. And if we open the first thing in that list, we've got all the translations to Spanish. If you'd also translated to French and German, then you would have 0, you'd have 1, you'd have 2. But we only did Spanish translations. So let's see what it's translated. Now we've got Spanish translation. We've also got the actual text that was translated. So let's open that. And again, that's an array. This is all an array because it's all lists. So we translated, first of all, hello. And of course, that translated to hola, the Spanish word for hello. And of course, we also translated how are you, which of course translates to como estas. Clearly my Spanish accent needs a lot of practice, but if you're familiar with Spanish at all, you'll probably know those two phrases. And you can essentially see that what we asked for has happened. I mean, we just made an API request to a computer in some far off land. I've got no idea what it is. It could be anywhere. And it's actually translated text for us. We've actually got the computer to do that by writing in this computer style language. So in a nutshell, that's exactly how it works. You simply send your parameters exactly as it tells you to, and this is how it pops out. Now, if you were sitting here with a blank body, you would probably have no idea how to write in what we just wrote in. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how do you take this documentation and implement it without fully understanding it in the way a programmer would, because you don't have 6 months to sit and learn programming, and frankly that's not the best investment of your time. So what we'll do in the next video is we'll show you how to go from a blank slate to actually having a translation app. And we're going to do that again without having to really get any more technical. I'm just going to show you how to map over from an API documentation over to an actual app. One last thing I would just like to cover while we're here. We obviously talked about this idea of headers. Now, we didn't cover these in too much detail in the last video, but essentially, whenever you make an API call, you're going to send over some parameters, right? So we've just done a translation API call, and we've sent over everything that we wanted to translate. But whenever you send an API call, there's some additional things that you need to send. So for example, in the last video, we talked about having an API key. And an API key is the way that you authenticate and identify yourself to an API. So rather than include that in the parameters, most APIs will make you put that in what's called the headers. And you'll find that that every API has, or not every API, but every API tool that you use or every no-code interface you use, you'll find that they have a slot for the headers. And so we'll show you this on Retool very, very shortly, but you'll always have a slot that you can put this straight in. So we've got an API key. RapidAPI will give you an API key and it will be auto-filled in here. So you'll notice on your screen, you'll see a different kind of long collection of letters and numbers. Remember the key lesson from the last video: never ever ever share your API key. Obviously you can see mine right now, and so in theory you could take that API key, start making a bunch of requests, and after you've made 300 it would start charging my card money. But thankfully what I'm going to do is, by the time you're watching this video, I will already have changed that API key to something else. But it's a good lesson to keep in mind. And then often APIs will just ask you to basically copy and paste information. So we've got this one here, RapidAPI host, and all we're going to have to do is copy and paste that into our no-code tool when we're actually making an API call. So we'll show you how to do that in the next video, but just something to keep in mind with the header parameters. But with that said, let's go ahead, jump on to the next video. We're going to explore Retool, and we're going to go ahead and build our translation app. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in just a second.